Welcome to the second week of Bay's Bible. We are so glad to have you here with us at the beginning of the church year in Advent. If this is your first time here with us, please feel free to check out last week's video in which we covered the first week of Advent. See, because during the Advent season, we are covering the basic truth that Advent is not just when we commemorate the first coming of Christ. It is when we anticipate the second coming of Christ. Now, in last week's readings, we saw how to prepare ourselves, that is, our hearts and our minds, for the coming of Jesus Christ. But this week, we're going to look at how to prepare the way for God to arrive. Again, it's like if you were expecting a good friend to come over. You might wonder to yourself, oh, am I ready to see them again? Or are we ready to talk about that thing? How do I express my political disagreement without being one of those people? Or in a similar example with wedding planning, you might say, oh, am I ready to make this commitment? Oh, am I really ready to marry this person? But then there are also the really practical questions of how do we get the guest list ready? Where is it going to be? And how do we get the single guys and girls to actually meet each other and to actually dance on the dance floor together instead of staying in their same-sex friendship huddles? Pretty basic question. All of this, goes into wedding planning. Well, so likewise in Advent, during the first week, we anticipate the second coming of Christ by preparing ourselves. This week, we are learning how to anticipate the second coming of Christ by preparing the way for God to come. Now, if you're an uber intellectual like me, you usually don't think about beauty, design, or aesthetics. But if life were that simple, we wouldn't have eyes for seeing. We wouldn't have noses for smelling. We wouldn't have tongues for tasting. We wouldn't have hands for feeling and touching. But the reality is, we are sensible creatures. We learn about the world through our senses. And yes, we can prepare our hearts and minds for our wedding day. We can prepare our hearts and minds for Christ coming among us. But if you don't have Christmas decorations, if you are not anticipating having a big feast, if you're not sick of la vis, la-di-da, then you're not preparing for Christmas. You're preparing for the land of Narnia under the witch's spell. So while last week we saw how it was to prepare our hearts and our minds for the coming of Christ, this week we're going to see how to prepare the way of the Lord. During the second week of Advent, then, we are given another enormously influential passage from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Last week, we mentioned how chapters 40 to 66 of the book of the prophet Isaiah address the southern kingdom of Judah as they go into the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. So when we encounter our passage this week at the beginning of chapter 40, we meet Israel in the place of despair and desolation, their ethnic heritage destroyed, their temple destroyed with the inability to worship God properly. If there ever was an end of history, the peak of all empires, it was very clear during the time of the Israelites that the end of history was met with the Babylonian Empire. And all the empirical evidence suggested that this was true, that Babylon was going to take over and rule. So, for the Israelites to claim that they would gather back into their land, they would repopulate the land, and they would rebuild their temple and worship their God, this was laughable. This was inconceivable in that world. It is like today if we were to say that the indigenous peoples of North America were to receive back all unjustly stolen land, see the return of the buffalo population, be the majority ethnic group on the continent and see their rituals and worship practices honored within the halls of Parliament. Just not really conceivable. But prophets are not prophets because they extrapolate from hopeful signs in the present. They say, oh, that looks good, and maybe that will grow into this. No, prophets are prophets because they know the center of reality itself, God, and they know that God is going to see his people through. So the message of Isaiah is the exile will come to an end. Will come to an end. And God will lead the Judeans back through the desert from the east in the Babylonian Empire to their promised land back in the west. Now, while Isaiah is clearly speaking to a particular time and place, he also says something very important about the character, the God that we worship. See, first we have a little voice, like the still small voice that spoke to Elijah. This voice asks for someone to cry out, to which the prophet responds, "What am I to say?" And then the voice gives a comparison between the impermanence of the people and the permanence of the Word of God. Now, at first, this message can seem somewhat pessimistic. Everyone's going to die, and the world is going to fade like grass, and it's all going to be over anyway. Thanks for that, especially during COVID time when people have lost loved ones and we're just being reminded that it's all over with. But this message can also be enormously hopeful because the Judeans, like us in the post-COVID world, have had to adjust to a new normal, right? We've all had to adjust to this new normal. And God's message to his people through the prophet Isaiah is that exile is over. That this new normal you've had to adjust yourself to is like the grass. It will pass away. The profitability of injustice, the prosperity of the unjust and the wicked, the chaotic outrage of the peoples, the rage of the nations, these and the imaginations and the conspiracies, these will all pass away. But this promise of God to deliver his people will stand forever. Last week we had the passage from Mark 13, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And now God is giving that same message to Isaiah. This promise for God to deliver his people from exile will not pass away. It will be fulfilled. And we, during the season of Advent, are being commissioned to go and proclaim the second coming of Christ to the nations. In order to prepare the way for the arrival of God, we first have to invite the guests. What is going on in our psalm, and you can notice this if you look at verses 3 to 7, is that our psalmist is remembering one of God's past acts of deliverance and using that past act of deliverance as an assurance that God will do so again. God, you did save our ancestors from Egypt, so we know that you can deliver us from Babylon. In Isaiah, when we talked about how the word of God will stand forever, in Mark, we saw how Jesus' words will never pass away. Well, how can we be assured of this? And it is by noting past acts of deliverance for the people of God. Now, let's get into some silliness here, because in verses 10 to 13, you will notice that there is kissing involved. Now, in American evangelicalism, there was a very popular hymn a number of years ago called "How He Loves." And this is a very, very nice song about God's love for humanity. However, there was one lyric in the song which was controversial. And it was controversial because it read, "Heaven meets earth like a sloppy, wet kiss. And some people had trouble with sloppy wet. Like a lot of people have trouble with the word moist. You know, the same kind of uncomfortableness. So one Christian band that decided they wanted to cover this song changed the lyrics from heaven meets earth like a sloppy wet kiss to heaven meets earth like an unforeseen kiss. You know, one of those surprise kisses that comes out of nowhere. Well, what does this have to do with our psalm exactly? Well, when our psalmist speaks of righteousness and peace, kissing, what kind of a kiss are we talking about here? Are we talking about a peck, French? What kind of kiss is it? Well, the Hebrew word for kiss here is nashak. Now, nashak carries a variety of meaning. It really does. It can mean the kiss of a grandparent to a child, something very innocent, or it can be used in the erotic love poem Song of Songs, in which the lovers are kissing more than just their lips. But in the midst of all this silliness in talking about kisses, there is actually something really profound and wonderful going on here in our psalm. For very often in life, if we're given two positive qualities, sometimes they're in tension with one another. In the political scene, we talk about security versus freedom. You know, how do we protect ourselves from spread of the coronavirus while not taking away the civil liberties of being able to travel and so forth? Or, you know, when it comes to dinner table conversation, there is both being respectful and being nice, but as well as speaking your mind and saying what you believe is true. So these goodnesses are often in tension with one another. But what we notice in our psalm is that all these good things that sometimes in our lives are held in tension come together, they meet, and there is no tension or conflict in the various goodnesses that we seek for in our lives. In New Testament scholarship, it is almost universally accepted that 2 Peter is an example of pseudepigraphy. And the reason that scholars think this is that 2 Peter borrows large portions of its text from the Epistle of Jude, which scholars do deem to be an earlier writing. What does this mean? It means that 2 Peter was almost certainly not written by the Apostle Peter. Now, New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman take these conclusions about history in terms of pseudepigraphy, who wrote what. But then he later makes an ethical argument, saying that pseudepigraphy is a form of lying. But do we have to think of pseudepigraphy as a form of lying? Do we think that the writer of 2 Peter is trying to intentionally deceive people into thinking that they are Peter? I don't think that we have to think of it this way, because there's a phenomenon you may have noticed either in hip-hop music or in presidential literature known as ghostwriting. Ghostwriting is when someone hires someone else to write in their name, but nevertheless they are expressing the ideas of that person. In other words, it's not a form of lying, it is someone else giving words, giving speech to someone else's ideas. In this case then, I would say that pseudepigraphy is not a form of lying. It is rather like someone who is a fan of someone else writing in their name. Okay, so with that scholarly point just out of the way, we can begin to dig into our text. Our text begins with a quotation from Psalm 90 verse 4, which makes a similar point to what we read earlier in Isaiah, contrasting the impermanence of humanity with God's permanence. But it also makes an extremely important insight about our experience of time versus God's eternity, because we experience time as past, present, and future. But God does not experience time at all. God experiences timelessness, one eternal, forever present now. Not just a really long string of time, not just like forever and ever and ever and ever, but literally no time at all. This is difficult for us as time-bound creatures to understand. So from our perspective, we often ask God, why are you taking so long? Why is it taking so many years? But from God's perspective, He's not taking any time at all. He is working everything out simultaneously in one eternal now. Especially because God desires that no one perish and what we will experience as a future judgment. St. Augustine, the 4th century Bishop of Hippo, he contrasts Christ's second coming with his first coming. The first coming of Christ the Lord was in obscurity. The second will be in the sight of the whole world. When he came in obscurity, it was to be judged. When he comes openly, it will be to judge. In light of knowing then that everything is going to be disclosed, like a wiki leak, how are we to anticipate the second coming of Christ by preparation of the way? 2 Peter says, by pursuing justice in our daily lives. Lastly, we come to our gospel reading, in which it certainly looks like that a certain someone read Isaiah, doesn't it? Let's compare then Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3 with Mark chapter 1, verse 3. There's a very subtle difference. In Isaiah we have, a voice cries out, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. But in Mark we have the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. It's a very subtle difference, but in the Hebrew, in the wilderness is part of the message. Make a way in the wilderness for God to bring his people from Babylon in the east to the promised land in the west. But in the Greek, in the wilderness suddenly becomes not part of the message, but the location in which the message is proclaimed from. So when John the Baptist reads Isaiah 40, he sees it as a mandate to go into the wilderness and proclaim the message from there, that God is returning. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, comfort her, tell her her sins are over. And he does this with baptism, telling everyone, get ready for God's arrival. What does this teach us about preparing the way of the Lord? It actually teaches us preparing the way for the Lord by austerity to our bodies. Look at verse 6, in which John the Baptist eats honey and locusts and wears leather loincloths, and it's normally used just to portray how strange John the Baptizer is. But think about it for a moment. John the Baptizer is doing this intentionally. Why? Well, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, who in some of the earliest teaching that we have to new Christians, those that are about to be baptized, called the Catechetical Lectures, he writes in the Catechetical Lectures that John the Baptist fed on locusts to make his soul grow wings. Satiated with honey, the words he spoke were sweeter. Clothed in a garment of camel's hair, he exemplified in his own person the holy life. But why am I recommending austerities to the body during Advent? Why are we being encouraged to take down austerities during Advent? Well, it's because our Christian forebears knew a truth that we in prosperitist societies have often forgotten, which is that if we deprive our body of simple, temporary, and voluntarily chosen pleasures, if we deprive our bodies of those, we give our souls space to feel what God is doing in our hearts and in our minds. In other words, if we abstain from simple, temporary, and voluntarily chosen pleasures, if we deprive our bodies in these ways, we actually make more room for our souls to feel the presence of God and what He is doing within us. For it turns out that one of the places that Christ most desires to dwell is in our own hearts. But that is for another week. How might we then prepare the way of the Lord by our bodies? If it's not getting baptized, then what might else we do? Maybe we need to abstain from meat. Maybe we need to eat less. Maybe we need to not eat out as much, but cook more at home. Maybe we need to be more hospitable to our neighbors and invite them over more. Maybe we need to break certain appetites and attachments and certain foods that we depend on in order to get us through our lives. Try intermittent fasting, or eating Christmas goodies only on Sundays. Or maybe we need to take a break from mirrors, or a break from our computers, or a break from our phones, and stop worrying what other people think about how we look and how we're perceived, and to give less attention and focus to how others perceive our bodies. Maybe we need to exercise more. Maybe we need to take longer, harder walks in the cold just to feel it against our face. Maybe we need to start kneeling during our church services, to actually use those little stools that come out from the bottom of the pew and actually kneel during prayer. Or maybe, as many of us have during COVID been deprived of, abstain from singing. All of these things, taking them at little short steps at a time, leave more space in our souls to experience what God is trying to do in our hearts and minds. It leaves us more attentive to Him, and it leaves us to prepare the way for His coming into our hearts. In conclusion then for this week, we want to remember that last week we were shown how to prepare our hearts and our minds for the second coming of Christ. But this week we've seen how to prepare the way. Because the overall short lesson of Advent is not just the time we commemorate the first coming of Christ, it is the time when we anticipate the second coming of Christ. And this week we have been taught 4 different ways as to how to prepare the way for God. With Isaiah, by proclaiming the message of God's return to others. With our psalm, by rejoicing for the goodness in our lives. With 2 Peter, by repenting and striving to be righteous and just indeed. With our gospel, by preparing our bodies through fasting and other reasonable and safe austerities. And with that, we look forward to seeing you here next week. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for details as to how you can support this work that we are doing here at Base Bible for you and the church.